Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm continuing my series into let me check the name, Introduction to Methods of Qualitative Research. This is the second installment of it. Technically it's the third, but I count the first one and this one. The one that I already have existing in ethics is in line with this lecture series, but obviously the content information here is far more sort of dense. It's a lot more substantial. So in any event, this is more of the qualitative methods research. Again, the goal being to have at least 40 hours of lecture on qualitative methodologies, not in this series, but in the combination of the three. And that's pretty significant. To sit down through 40 hours of lecture on qualitative methodologies is a ton of content information, not to include the notes that correspond with each. So it's a substantial amount of information. We are going to be on section 1.2. In order to access the notes, just click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Download it. Use it to supplement your reading. So this is going to be section 1.2 on page 5 of my notes. Let's begin. So this is Introduction to Methods of Qualitative Research. And this is going to be section 1.2. And let's begin. So this is our third installment of the discussion of deconstructivism as applied to qualitative methodologies. As I said before, my intent is not to take the time to fully explain or flesh out the various concepts in deconstructivism. That's not the intent of this lecture series. The intent is to take the concepts from deconstructivism and apply them to qualitative methodologies. There will be various interpretations of deconstructivist model, but the idea is to take those existing concepts and see how they can be utilized by qualitative methodologists, by fledgling researchers, or maybe even, maybe sort of even master researchers. There's always more we can learn, and apply this to your research methodology. Again, with respect to the deconstructivist model, it's difficult to even call it a model, so I call it an approach. With respect to the deconstructivist approach, there isn't a formulaic means of arriving at truth. There isn't a formulaic means of arriving at self-identification. The ways in which the deconstructivist approach work is to create a sense of discomfort, to create a sense of recognition of those things that otherwise would have fallen back into the recesses, right? And recognize, if you will, the opportunity that, and I'm jumping ahead into this lecture today, recognize the opportunity that is presented to you as a researcher when your participant arrives at some tensions, when your participant arrives at a gap, a lacuna in his or her memory of the event and such. The one thing that I did want to clarify with respect to the last lecture that it wasn't quite clear. I was thinking about it. I was thinking about it after I shot the video and uploaded the video, was the relationship between the event and the individual subject. And this is going to be the subject participant. So with respect to the subject participant, we recognize, as we said, that the totality of information contained within the event, that is the occurrence, the happening, right? And I talked about the happening. The happening of the event informs interpretation, such that interpretation is itself a consequence of the event, right? So we know that interpretation is a consequence of the event, right? With respect to the subject, what I wasn't as clear as I could have been, I wasn't as clear as I could have been. The subject's interpretive experience, the subject's interpretive experience of the event, his or her recollection of the account of what happened, right? The happening of the event. That is uniquely subjective to the individual. However, there is an objectivity to it. It does, or it did, in fact, refer to a series of events. And the deconstructivist approach technically speaking, this idea of the subject or even the participant is challenged. I'm not going to apply that to the qualitative methodology because it becomes very, very abstract and difficult to, one, lecture on, and two, apply to the experience with your participant. But you can imagine that my interpretation of an event, whatever the event might be, and I have to let my brain warm up with examples. I don't have an example ready in my head just yet. But you were a member of an event. You go to an event. A few months later, you recall what happened in that event. Your recollection of what occurred is uniquely subjective. No one's going to deny that fact, right? It's your memory. It was your interpretation. The interpretation of the event is specifically subjective, right? So that the interpretation is, in part, subjective. That is, it's your interpretation. However, that subjective interpretation refers to objective criteria, objective facts. On the date of XYZ, I saw these people, this thing occurred, that thing, so on and so forth. So that with respect to the subjective interpretation, and this is very important, so I apologize that I didn't put it in my notes, but it's so much going through my brain during these lecture series. Something's bound to get lost in the shuffle. But we found our wandering concept, and we will bring our concept back into the fold. With respect to the interpretation of subjectivity, the interpretation of the subjective experience, it refers, right? It refers to objective fact. In these examples, there's examples when it's subjective, but that's more psychological, so I'm not going to get into that. But the interpretation is itself subjective. The interpretation is subjective, to be clear. That subjective interpretation, however, refers to objective fact. It refers to stuff in the world. The fact that this subjective interpretation refers to objective fact is the means with which, so the subjective interpretation referring to objective fact, and I'll put fact in quotes. I only put it in quotes because it's complicated to talk about facts, but facts in the colloquial sense, what you would understand is objectively verifiable, tangible, empirically viable, that type of fact, right? Subjective interpretation referring to objective fact is the condition for understanding. This is the condition for understanding. So you can imagine that I could, based on a person's interpretive account, identify, quote unquote, the truth, or at least partially the truth of the event. I can go back and have epistemic accessibility to the individual's experience, right? There is a problem in any qualitative methodology when you're dealing with a participant that the participant could in fact be lying, right? And I get this question all the time from my graduate students: how do we know whether or not what the participant is telling us is in fact true? Couldn't they be lying? And the point is, of course they can be lying. The whole thing could be fabricated. The way in which you recognize systems in place, and the deconstructivist really approach shouldn't be called a system, but the deconstructivist approach could be applied as a means of understanding, is the recognition that what they're saying refers to stuff in the world. And if you wanted to, you could seek to verify what they're saying, right? Their subjective interpretation is subjective, granted, but it refers to something, right? This is assuming that we're not talking about subjective interpretations referring to subjective interpretations. There's a whole class that can be discussed on that. I'm not talking about that sort of specific category. We're talking about the overwhelming general category where my subjective interpretation of things that occurred can be objectively verified, at least, and I'll talk about this in a second, could be objectively verified, and that ability for verification, right, objective fact, i.e., I'll also put verification in quotes, because I don't want to have a sort of positivist tone to this, but sort of, you get the general idea, right, because I could deconstruct this forever. But my subjective interpretation of the event, of the happening, obviously lends itself to my own experience. I remember the event being XYZ. I remember it being this. We recognize that while there are some events that have very strict rules determining interpretation, that it was clearly this and it should only be interpreted like this, most events overwhelmingly are diversified. The interpretational account of the event could be, multifaceted. An individual who has a particular interpretation of an event, recognizing that that particular interpretation of an event only applies to his or her subjective experience, the question becomes, they could be lying to us about their interpretation. They could just fabricate the whole thing. The point is, if you think that the participant could potentially be lying, don't let the participant know that you don't believe them. Take the content of their information, you can go through the transcriptions after, and recognize that what they're saying refers to stuff in the world, and see if you can get third-party validation of what they've said. If you're able to get objective, verified, third-party validation of the content of their subjective interpretation, then that third-party verification validates their subjective interpretation. It yields credibility to their narrative, right? At least in part. Now, granted, you can complicate this with deception. I'm not going to talk about that. But the idea is objective third-party validation. It offers a huge degree of credibility to subjective interpretation. Now, there is a distinction that is verification in practice and in principle. I don't want to spend too much time on that because that will take me sort of substantially off of my lecture series sort of guide. I wanted to talk about that, just so a really quick tidy of verification in practice and in principle. The idea is we want to try and seek verification in practice, the ability to verify as an understanding of how it's done. Here is how I verified that the subjective interpretation of my participant was in fact valid. He said that they experienced this thing on this date roughly. I went into the archives, I actually looked at the event and recognized that, their date that they recalled was exactly the date that occurred, and the experience, though not exactly the same, was similar to what my participant was saying. I can validate the experience of my participant. And it's not that you need to do this, but if it's called into question, you can go about an objective mode of verification, right? So that's it in practice. In principle, it might be difficult to verify. You can imagine that the event or the occurrence was an event that doesn't have quote-unquote historical significance, but it had personal significance, and there's no way to go back into one's personal life to find that verification. And then you would go about making sure that the logic of the narrative is consistent. Unfortunately, I can't do, if I do a fourth installment of this lecture series, it might be sort of no, actually I probably wouldn't lecture on that publicly. I wouldn't lecture on that publicly. But yes, there are ways in which you could go about verifying the internal consistency of a personal narrative rather than a historical narrative. Historical narratives have objective reference to, microfiche, and people probably don't use microfiche anymore, to, e-files and such. Whereas personal narratives, they don't have historical reference, so we have to look for the credibility of the narrative internal to their logic. Okay, so sorry for that tangent, but I wanted to make sure that I made that clear. It's not, properly speaking, sort of deconstructivist proper, but it is the application of an epistemic check to an interpretive account, right? This is how you check. This is how you go about potentially validating a subjective interpretational account. And the question is, well, how do I know that it's true? That's sort of a general way to go about structuring a validation if you need it. Okay, so let's move on. So I did that, so let's begin. Let's begin, finally. So the deconstructivist, the deconstructive event, and this will be my last section. I think this is the last section on deconstructivism. We'll be moving on in section 1.3. Yeah, we'll be moving on. So, source of the tension and disruption signal the deconstructive event, and we know this. I spent a considerable amount of time discussing this. It's the moment at which there is a disruption, a sense of dis-ease. There's a sense of confusion. There's an internal conflict in the narrative. It's the moment in your interview where the participant pauses for a long time and has to contemplate. It's the moment where your participant might get choked up and might start to cry. It's the moment where your participant, I talked a little bit about body language in the ethics of qualitative methods. I talked about sort of nonverbal communication. So an astute researcher would be looking, you're not just listening to what's being said, you're also looking for nonverbal cues that your participant might be a little uncomfortable. And the idea is tactfully, you can, it's funny, it's funny. That's amazing, that just popped in my head. I gotta give you an example. I can't believe this just popped in my head. And it's super brief. Last night, as a matter of fact, now I'm sort of telling you where this is in time, but last night I was at the house and my son, I've been training him to be, and my daughter a little bit, but I don't want to force it. She's not really as interested as he is. But obviously I like puzzles and I like problem solving. This is what I do for a living. And I'm always seeking to learn more. But I'm trying to teach my son, how to do puzzles and problem solving. And so I gave him, a couple years back, a Tower of Hanoi to solve. So he tries to, solve the problem. And a couple years ago, he solved it. It's been 2 or 3 years since he's even picked it up. And just for kicks, last night, challenge him to see if he can still solve it, if he still got it. And of course, make a long story short, he did solve it. There was a point, however, where he forgot the solution. The algorithm sort of escaped him, and you could see him trying to figure out what the solution was, but he didn't have a deductive means. He didn't have even an inferential means. It was all gut. You saw him struggling with it, like, okay, where does this go? And he had to intuitively solve it, and I felt his frustration. And I'm watching him, I'm being quiet, of course, I'm letting him do his thing, giving him space. But I sensed this frustration, and I asked him, I was like, something along the lines of, are you okay? Everything okay? That recognition on my part that he was uncomfortable, and the simple act of saying, hey, is everything okay, or are you okay, reassured him, and like in the next, 30 seconds to a minute, he got back into the solution. That was an instance where the deconstructivist would recognize within the participant that sense of something's amiss here. Something's off. I don't know what the conditions are. I don't know what the nature of the question was that I asked the participant X, but I'm seeing a signal that there's something discomforting here. Let me assess. Let me check. Is everything okay? Do you want some time? Do you want to talk about what you're feeling right now? Oh yeah, well really, I hadn't thought about it until you asked me the question, but yeah, it's ... More content information, more that you can build into your final qualitative methodology. But if you're sort of disaffected by the discomfort, by the distress even of your participants, what'll end up happening is rather than communicating and sharing information with you, your participant will shut down and keep you outside of the content. And the idea is always to sort of extend the metaphor, right? To sort of extend the olive branch and offer your participant an opportunity to tap out for a little bit, offer your participant the opportunity to pause, to reflect. And that gesture in and of itself, as a consequence of this recognition, will allow for a further deconstructivist account, right? Of more content information, which will probably lead to more abstraction and will lead to, obviously, more interpretational accounts, right? A different, diverse, I never thought of that, yeah. I never thought of that. It was a consequence of ... So you get the sort of general idea. All right, so then, rather than running or fleeing discomfort, this is explaining what I just said, rather than running or fleeing from discomfort, the sense of discomfort presents an opportunity of, or it should be for, interpretive transformation. Right? It's this moment, this feeling, right? So we have the participant, we have the researcher, you have the participant, the researcher, and you get a cue from the participant that there is a sense of, let's say, discomfort. It's your obligation to acknowledge these discomfort, or at least the potential. ACKNOWLEDG. Right? Acknowledge it. Acknowledge it. Hey, I see that is everything okay? I see that are you okay? Do you want a break? Is this too much? Do you want to stop? Do you need a napkin? Acknowledge. And I know this seems sort of obvious, like duh, but you'd be surprised, right? Especially graduate students. I mean, I was there myself. You're so preoccupied, you could become so preoccupied with going down your checklist and having all your questions met because you know the clock's running, you know you've got an hour for this interview, an hour and a half for this interview, and if you don't go through all of your questions, you know, it's going to be impartial, it's going to be partial, and you might have to scrap it, so you're just like, let me go through this list, And insofar as you're directed towards getting your questions answered, you're apathetic, really, to the comfort of your participant. And if your participant senses that, it's over. It's over. You've completely lost, right? The idea is to be in tune and acknowledge the discomfort of your participant. Why? Because just the acknowledgement alone lets the participant know, hey, this person is interested in my narrative. This person is interested in my story. This person is going to push me, but the person's not, you, the researcher, you're not going to push me to a point where I'm distressed, right? Where I feel confrontational. I feel some sense of confrontation. And this simple act of sort of assessing their level of comfort is enough to motivate them to give you more, right? And that's the idea. We want to be able to have very rich data. We want to arrive at what's known as saturation, and I talked about this in the first installment. We want to arrive at data saturation, and the acknowledgement of your participants' levels of comfort facilitates saturation, right? It's one of the ways in which we can arrive at data saturation. The inability or the apathetic approach to your participants' level of comfort is just going to shoot you in the foot, right? So make sure, take your eyes off of your paper, acknowledge, establish eye contact, and sort of human gestures of concern is important. So the disruption of norms, now we're getting a little bit different. The disruption of norms, quote, by difference being given voice, that's key, right? By difference being given voice, establishes a condition for the deconstructivist event. We remember that difference, D-I-F-F-E-R-A-N-C-E, difference is a combination of difference plus deferral. However you spell it, sorry. So difference is a combination of difference and deferral. We are going to defer. Right? The question now becomes sort of the state of deferral. And what's being deferred, and I love this bit because it is slightly Nietzschean, right? I'm not sure if Derrida would particularly like that, but this is my interpretive account because I know Nietzsche rather well. The idea is we're deferring absolute truth. We're collapsing. This is what Nietzsche does. He collapses polemics, right? You say it's either this or it's that. You have some binary opposition. You have some binary opposition like good or bad. You have unjust or just, and on and on. You have these binary oppositions: good, bad, just, unjust. Moral, immoral, stuff like that. Not legal, illegal. Moral, immoral. You have these binary oppositions, and like Nietzsche, the deconstructivist is going to collapse these sort of totalizing, but they're called binary oppositions. The deconstructivist approach is going to collapse, if you're doing it well, it's going to collapse binary oppositions, right? It's not clearly the case that this is either moral or immoral. It's gray, right? It's open for, now legal, illegal, there's definitely a distinction. There's a fine line between what's legal and illegal. Morality, and I don't want to go too much into the morality bit, this always gets me in trouble. But the idea is, I do believe in morals, I get the idea, but practically speaking, I mean, with respect to your participant, you can imagine that you find your participant in a situation disclosing not acts that are legal and illegal. We understand the Internal Review Board protocol for the disclosure of illegal acts, obviously, duh. But we're talking about acts of morality, right? It's not up to us as participants to be prosecutors. We're not judges, right? We're not here to make assessments, moral assessments on the acceptability of personal conduct. We should be gracious that our participants are sharing information with us, right? But the idea is, if we arrive, and you are bound to arrive at this in many instances of your narrative, right? You're bound to arrive at this, where individuals. I had, what was his name? Oh, I forgot. He's on my YouTube channel. He's on this channel. He's like the second video I uploaded. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I forgot his name. I remember Liesel, I can't remember his name. He told me that he escaped the Nazis. So, and I don't know if I have that particular audio clip up that he shared with me. If it wasn't him, it was Phil. It was Phil, I think. He escaped the Nazis, and he was young. I can't remember how young he was, maybe like 12, 13, 14, something like that. He escaped and fled and da-da-da. And, you know, people were tracking him. I mean, like, people are trying to hunt you down and kill you. And you can imagine that, and this is actually phenomenal now that I think about it. This is a perfect example. This is a perfect example. So, yeah, this is madness. This is a perfect example of what I'm talking about with respect to morality. You're being hunted, and the predator is coming after you. Now, they don't know, the predator doesn't know exactly where you are, but the predator has a sense of where you are. And the predator knows that if they find you, you're dead. Period. That's the game. So he's fleeing. He tries to escape, and there's a sense in which if you team up in security, right? Because traditionally the concept is, if I'm weak, binding collectively together, getting a group of us, we become stronger, right? So that the more of us there are, the stronger we are. But in this specific instance, it's exactly the opposite. If I'm fleeing and I'm trying to escape the hunt to survive, there isn't strength in numbers. It's precisely numbers that make me weak, because it's easier to identify me, the prey, when we're in groups. Right, so that the adage, I sort of always deconstruct the truth of the adage, there's strength in numbers. Right, it is true to some extent in this really sort of cliched adage, but when the hunt is on, and the predator is coming for you, it's actually better to go at it solo. It's better to break away from the group and be by yourself. Why? Because if you're with the group, it's easier to identify the prey. So that the idea is, you think about that. And I don't remember if he specifically told me this. I remember he said he fled and da-da-da. But you can imagine now, to extrapolate, you can imagine that on the road, escaping, trying to cross a border or something, he sees another friend that he might have known from school, or he sees, he sees someone in the community, another young boy or a young girl, and they want to team up. This would make a great fiction, right? This would be a great narrative. And the decision, but the other person doesn't see him. And the decision is at that moment, do I team up with this person and increase the likelihood that I'm going to get caught? Or do I remain hidden and move away from this person, knowing that it's probably likely that they'll get caught and not get away? This is a perfect example, right? Because is that good? The act of letting that person fend for themselves and not teaming up and working together? Is that an immoral act? No, of course it's not. The deconstructive and Nietzschean model would say it's not immoral. Right? It's not for us to make claims of ethics on the acts of individuals. The only thing we're concerned about, and this is probably not going to happen, is if something illegal is disclosed, right? But other than that, we're not here to make assessments. As a matter of fact, it's a prized bit of information if you get a narrative like that. That's a great narrative. Why? Because when you generalize it, you recognize the complexity of what it is to be a human. Right, the complexity of what it is, and if there is ever AI, the AI would have to be able to do that. Right, that's very dense. That's not deductive logic. That's not inferential logic. That's an intuition, right? It's intuitive. It just doesn't seem that it would be to my advantage to remain with this group. Why? Because if I remain with this group, I'm going to fall. I need to break away from this group and make sure that I'm on my own so that I can survive, right? And that's, selfish, maybe. But does it preserve life? It absolutely does, right? I talked with these people years after their attempted extermination, right? So does it make people strong? It absolutely does. Is it moral? It might not be. But that's the idea, right? That's the idea. I think that example clearly sort of gives you an understanding, right? The disruption of the norm. The norm being there is goodness, there is badness, there is justice, there is injustice, there is morality, there is immorality. The further along you get in your education, sorry, welcome to the real world. The further you get along in your education is the more these norms are going to be destabilized until the point at which you recognize it's wholly, always already socially constructed. And to the victor goes the spoils, but also to the victor goes morality. The victor determines what morality is. And it's up to you to determine, I don't want to go further than that, but it's up to you to determine the power of moral discourse and the influence that it has. Not for us to be able to say what the individual did was right or wrong. We're not, which is also another binary opposition, right? Another polemic. So 5C, here's a direct quote. To talk about deconstruction as destabilizing is to approach the data in ways that prevent the closure of meaning. And the example that I just gave is perfect, right? It lends itself to good argument. Was that act just? Oh no, he should have, teamed up with the other kid, and tried to help. Because if the kid was, if the kid was weaker than him, he could have helped him. If the kid was stronger than him, then the kid could have helped him, and so on. No, he's right in what he did, because we don't have epistemic access to whatever happened to the narrative of that kid, and da-da-da. There's a debate for this, right? The idea is it just? No one knows, but there isn't a closure. There isn't a definitive, nice and tidied bow around it. Now, granted, if I were to do, not this, but if I were to do another sort of fictional account, I like that idea of not having closure. I'm the type where I do like all my ends tidied. That's who I am as sort of a person. If I were writing fictionally, it would be an interesting story where it sort of ends in sort of in that. And I'm going to give you the technical terms in this section in a bit. I don't want to jump ahead. But the idea is the deconstructivist approach is not an approach that ends with a nice, tidied narrative, where all the ends have been sort of knotted and all the logic has been connected and all the dots have been dotted and such, right? It's not that. The deconstructivist approach is an approach where you might get to the end of the narrative and have nothing but questions that have not been satisfied. And it's not about persisting. It's not about having all your questions satisfied. Why? Because it might feel to your participant that, you don't care about them. Their levels of exhaustion, their levels of discomfort, their levels of, you get a vibe like, okay, it's time to sort of end the narrative now. Everything that has been said, and I'm starting to get the same story. Maybe I should move on, but you're like, well, you know what, I still have like 20 more minutes before, the agreed time ends. So let me milk this last 20 minutes. That's precisely what you don't want to do, right? If you've got all the content information you need to get, you still got 20 minutes on the clock before the agreed upon time expires, call it a day, right? That's sort of a real ghetto sort of application, but it's a good application, right? It's a common sense application. Why? Because it's not about making sense all the time. I think we, in the Western world, have a bias towards, and I think we ought to, but I think we overly bias definitive accounts, absolutist, homogenizing, totalizing accounts. And the truth of the matter is, when we're talking about people's lives, how many people do you know that have absolute accounts on their life? I don't know anybody. Everybody's working on something. There's loose ends all over the place, and some things that will be a loose end for the totality of their life, for the rest of their life. Some things just won't ever be tidied up. And that's part of what it is to be a human being, right? It's discomforting at times. But as I said in the earlier section, you should find, or at least attempt, or try to find some comfort in that discomfort. It'll make you strong. All right, so number 6, or page 6, next page. So a qualitative approach of this is any and all genealogical accounts of one's relationship to his or her victimization inherently denies closed, totalized meaning. For example, watch this scene in Watchmen, and actually watch it. So I'll pause for a second, watch the scene, it's like a minute, and then come back. Okay, so, in the scene, what ends up happening is the original Silk Spectre, not her daughter, she was almost raped by the comedian. So the comedian comes in when they were younger, and the comedian tries to rape her, and they get in a physical altercation. Fortunately for her, the rape never occurs. And despite the fact that this man, he punches her in the stomach, he hits her in the face, forces her over the pool table, despite the fact that he tried to rape her, years had passed, and the interpretation of that event subsided and changed. It changed so much that she, Silk Spectre, had consensual sex with a man who tried to rape her in the past. Now, you can imagine the genius of Watchmen. The idea that that is even possible. The idea that that's even possible shows you that there isn't going to be definitive closure. Because the idea is, this man tried to rape me, and for the rest of my life, he's a rape. And I'm not making implications beyond this. If this offends you, I am not trying to offend. I am not trying to say that, this is not a preach for, I don't do preaching. This isn't a pulpit. This isn't about forgiveness. That's not what I'm saying here. If you want to be upset and vengeful, I acknowledge that. I believe in that. This is specifically to this example, right? All I'm trying to say here, because I want to be clear, right? Because this could start to sound like a pulpit, and I don't preach, right? I teach. The idea is, in terms of closure, you would think that the experience of the rapist attempting to rape his or her victim would forever be, would definitively and totalizing and forever be, you're bad, I'm good, I will never forgive you, and that's the end. In this case, in the Watchmen, they got beyond that. They got beyond the event, right? That event wasn't wrapped in a nice little bow. The narrative was good guy, bad guy. No, she ends up having consensual sex with the comedian, and they bear Silk Spectre too. They have a daughter. He has a daughter. She has a daughter with the very man who tried to rape her. Her daughter makes this realization, Silk Spectre 2 makes this realization later, much, much later in life, much to her, amazement and horror and awe, all of that combined in one. Like, Mom, how could you? I don't understand. And her mom says one of the most genius things in, cinema history. I would love for someone to just build another, not just qualitative methodological application for you creative writers. This is you could write an entire manuscript on this concept of revisiting your past with a whole new different interpretation. And what she says is, as you get older, the future gets darker. Death is on the horizon. You know that your time is limited. And the stuff in front of you looks really dark. So you turn back and you look back to your past, and the things that used to look dark, in comparison to death, look really bright. And obviously she's referencing the attempted rape. With the prospect of death on the horizon, you look back at your past and you're like, I lived, I'm a survivor, right? I can't believe I got Beyonce flowing through my blood right now, but this is sort of like, I'm a survivor, I will not give up, right? I'm going to work harder, right? I look back on my past, and the things that didn't, this is Nietzsche, right? The things that didn't kill me made me strong. Right? So you look back at the horrors, you look back at the bad with the prospect of a certain death in the future, and the past doesn't look as bad as it once did. That's creme de la creme. That's, as for me, coupled with Heidegger's being toward death, which I'm not going to talk about, that's as good as it gets, right? That's as good as it gets. That's the motivation for life, right? Motivation for life is not to keep grudges, right? Again, not preaching. This is me. Not to keep grudges, move on. If I'm not going to talk to people, I'm not talking to them, I'm on to the next. But I'm not going to put myself and my brain in a box where I keep reliving a horrific event and I'm enslaved to my interpretation of some phenomenon. I mean, this is sort of the condition for PTSD, right? You're enslaved to a fixed interpretation of an event. You're horrified by faces, you're horrified by sound, you're horrified by the recollection of, and the consistent recollection of something tragic and something disheartening, horrifying. And all you have to recognize is, you're still alive. There's still a possibility. And you can transform that interpretation, you can transform that interpretive sort of experience, and you determine what it looks like. You make sense of what it was, right? So that it's not haunting you. You take control of your interpretation because it's your interpretation. That's the point. That's the genius of Silk Spectre. It's like, here it was, I could have been in a box for the rest of my life and been melancholic, and I could have been depressed personality because, here it is, my alleged victimizer tried to kill, you tried to rape me, you tried to do whatever. And no, I'm in control of that interpretation, right? It doesn't mean that you have to sort of do what she did. That's a bit extreme, right? Where you're having consensual sex and so on and so forth, or, it's complete reconciliation. But the idea is she took control of how she interpreted the event, and thus she gained control over the interpretational force of the event, rather than the interpretational force of the event consistently sort of imposing itself on her. No, not at all. So, I think that's just, it's just a good vibe. It's just really good energy, right? For me, I love that type of, that ability to free yourself from your own personal demons, right? The idea that you can take control and that you can master your past with nothing but sheer will. That's what I'm all about. So, I already explained this sort of, top of page 6. The original Silk Spectre was previously raped, and she wasn't actually raped, it was an attempted rape. So the original Silk Spectre, so my bad on that, there was an attempted rape by the comedian, and in reflection of her own victimization, her interpretation changes substantially from her earlier interpretation, good example of the deconstructivist event. So I just explained that. Number 2, this is important. Researchers must not impose their interpretive assumptions on the narratives and phenomenological descriptions of their participants. We're not in the business of making sense of their experience. We're not in the business of telling them how to interpret. We're not in the business of telling them that their interpretation is right or wrong. The idea is to create a condition, and this is important, the idea is to create a condition in which your participant recognizes the opportunity to have a new interpretation. The deconstructivist event, the deconstructivist moment, more specifically, is an opportunity to transform how we see our past, how we remember, how we recollect. It's an opportunity to take control of ourselves. Because at the end of the day, it's us. It's our subjective experience. So why am I going to have something that happened in my past that was bad determine who I'm going to be and forever keep me in a box? It's my past. It's my interpretation. I'm in control. I say what happens. And I'm not going to fashion it so that I end up weak. I'm going to fashion it so that I end up strong. Now, it's easy to do. It's easy to say, rather. And, we all have gone through this. I've lived a lot. I've done a lot. I've seen a lot. I've had a lot done to me. But the idea is, so without disclosing my own personal narrative, it's like I've been there. I've been there. It's not an easy thing to do. But Nietzsche's right. If it didn't kill you, you should be strong from it, right? Use whatever the atrocity was, the horror was. It doesn't necessarily always have to be bad, but I'm in conflict resolution, so you have to forgive me, right? Most of the examples everything that I do is conflict related. So I apologize if this comes off so conflictual, but that's sort of who I am and what I do. The idea is to make some reconciliation of that internal mental conflict, right? And you can do it. You can do it. You can do it. So don't impose your interpretation because it's not your, it's just not a good practice. The participant's interpretation is valid in and of itself and is not subject to a requirement for historical consistency. So the idea, as I said before, the referent for the referent for the subjective interpretation is some objective phenomena, some objective criteria. That objective criteria, that verification, can be historically verifiable, which means that you could sort of cross-check information, but it might be a personal narrative, a personal history that isn't dated and documented by some third party, at which point you're not going to be able to, quote-unquote, justify the narrative. All you're looking for is consistency, internal consistency, such that we can't say that there's any totalizing truth. You can't. If you followed me to this point, then I just don't see how you could possibly say that with respect to the event, there's a totalizing absolute truth of the event. Right? We're not talking about law. This isn't legal stuff, right? We're talking about phenomenology. We're talking about existential experience. We're talking about narrativized experience, recollection of one's personal history. We're not talking about the law. The idea is, no, there's multifaceted ways in which we could interpret a phenomena. So what are we deferring? To get back to deference, we are deferring truth. We're saying that, no, it's not just the fact that the comedian attempted to rape the original Silk Spectre, that's totalizing. and he is forever going to be labeled as that, and she is forever going to be labeled as a victim. No, there is the possibility for transformation. Now, that's just one case. It might not be like that for many others, but in this example, no, the truth is not totalizing. It's always an approximation to truth. It's always an approach to truth. There isn't a sense in which we are going to arrive at a definitive truth and thus everything will be tidied up, right? So it's the recognition of this fact and the willingness to be comfortable in that gray, right, in that gray area. So lastly, for number 6, on page 6, the requirement for interpretive historical consistency is antithetical to deconstructivism. The idea that we are going to say that this event happened on this day, and we can justify this by all these newspaper clippings and newspaper articles. The person told me his or her interpretation of the event. I verified and cross-checked that the event did occur and has semblance to the narrative disclosed by the individual, and thus what the individual says totalizes the experiential nature of the event is ludicrous. It's profound. I mean, it's obviously ludicrous, right? It's obscene to think that that's the case. No, it's one aspect of an infinitely complex phenomenological description of the event. The event, for the example is the snake leaves the nest or the den. I don't know what snakes live in. I think snakes live in dens. So the mother snake leaves the den. She's got her baby snakes in the den. They can't fend for themselves yet. She goes out and she goes into an adjacent den, and she gobbles up all of the little rat kids, right? And she brings them back to her den, and she feeds. She regurgitates this, and she feeds her little kids, the kids of the mother rat. Is the snake bad? Is the snake bad? No, the snake's not bad. The snake's living. The snake's providing for its own. The idea is the snake has a narrative, and the mother rat has a narrative. For the mother rat, the snake is the definition of evil. It is the oppressor. It is the invader. It is the destroyer. And that's true. For the snake babies, the mother is the victor. The mother is the hero. The mother snake is the provider. The mother snake is the nurturer. The mother snake is the individual that you aspire to be so that you can take care of your own in the next generation. And that's the idea. And then what does evolution do? Evolution transforms the rat into a mongoose, and then, now you got a real fight. So be a mongoose and not a rat. This is the moral of the damn story. Anyway, moving on. So the idea is there, you get the idea of this. You do this long enough, you have to entertain yourself. That's the whole genius of all of this. Is self-entertainment is the best entertainment. It wouldn't be good for celebrities, but it's great for me. The idea, which has nothing to do with anything. But the idea is, with respect to, more seriously, with respect to the absolute truth of the matter. No, truth is perpetually going to be deferred. Right? We are going to defer truth, and we are always going to approximate truth, and as such, we're going to recognize inherently that my assumptions ought to and should be and consistently will be destabilized. And as they are, I'm going to assume new axioms and such. So I'm going to pause at this point before I go into the next subject, which is the deconstructivist event is more akin to an unfolding. I'm going to pause at this point and then come back and continue with page 6. Okay, so the next section. The deconstructivist event is more akin to an unfolding. So the idea is we're going to look at the event, right? So, and the way we're going to think of the event, and instead of being sort of enclosed, right? Instead of it being enclosed like this, a better way of conceptualizing the event is to free it from this enclosure and to think of the event as more akin to this. This is the nature of the event, right? The event is more like this. And what you can imagine that the event flows through the individual and is disclosed to us. And what we're doing is there's a sense in which we're unraveling the narrative of the event, like almost like a spool, right? The event is unraveled, but imagine that this spiral is infinite. We're infinitely unraveling more and more of the event. We're attempting to make sense of it. It's not an enclosure, right? It's not really an enclosure. It's enclosed for maybe the participant in and of himself. But if you're doing a phenomenon, this is what I did for my dissertation, right? The event was the event of evil, the occurrence of evil, an attempt to have a phenomenological understanding of evil. This obviously presupposes the existence of evil. Secularists more talk about violence, but I do believe that you can have secular conceptions of evil. I'm not going to get into that now. And the idea is to try and have a phenomenological understanding of evil, what it is, right? Because it makes sense for everyone on the planet, except for really esoteric, ivory tower sitting academics who want to undermine its role. You ask any person anywhere in the world, you ask people in exploited situations, does evil exist? And they look at you like you're a moron. Of course it exists. The idea is to have an understanding of what that phenomenon is, recognizing that there are infinitely many ways to interpret this. And our attempt is to unravel, through this personal narrative, through disclosure, more of the sense, the sentiment, the feeling of the experience of being present with evil, or being present, let's do something better, right? Being present with joy, or being present with contentment, or being present with success, or being present with, community, right? The idea is that of being present. It's a presence. It's not a physical presence like myself and the tree, myself and the door, myself and the child, myself and the book. It's not that. It's a presence, right? Kanye, shout out to Yeezy, right? Kanye has a great line in one of his songs. He goes, "My presence is a present. My presence is a gift." Cocky, egomaniac, but that's a great line. My presence is a gift. My presence is a present. Good play on words, but more importantly, I think it captures the point. The idea is the presence of the phenomena is a gift. The presence allows you to unpack presence. That's so good, right? It's, I don't know how else to say it. Shout out to Weezy for real, right? Not Yeezy, not Weezy. Kanye really got that. I mean, this is a genius line. My presence is a present. Now, you forget Kanye now, right? I mean, that's just absurd. But you can imagine the presence of determination. I like that. For a graduate student, that's what you need. I'm your #1 cheerleader, right? Don't quit. Don't stop. Persevere. You can do it. You're going to get your dissertation done. Don't be discouraged. Don't stay in ABD land forever. And if you stay in ABD land, don't put PhD by your neck, because you're not a PhD. You're ABD, right? And to be honest with you, you don't want to be there. Complete what you started, so you can do it. Okay, yeah, I watched Dr. Campbell's videos. I can do this. He's motivated me. I get the idea. I can do this. I understand now. I can apply. I like this deconstructivist stuff. I can apply it. Okay, what am I interested? You're interested in whatever the phenomenon might be. You're interested in explaining more of this event, more of this happening. You recognize that there isn't going to be a totalizing explanation, and that frees you. I don't have to worry about a definitive account. I can't really be wrong. I can offer an interpretation. I can take collected stories from participants who experienced this thing, and I can synthesize what they've said, recognizing that as soon as I've synthesized it, it's just one little pull on this infinite spool. Right? What I've done is I've advanced a little bit more. It's the taskmaster. Heave, ho. Heave, ho. The ship goes forward. One little degree further more. We go forward in the future. Humanity progresses one little incremental bit forward, just a tad, because of your effort, right? And that's the idea. I'm going to make this contribution. I'm going to offer an account to recognize that it's just one little bit of new interpretive methodology, new interpretive account, new way of looking at the experience, recognizing that as soon as I do it, I've got more work to do. It's infinitely more, infinitely more. And you shouldn't be discouraged by that. You shouldn't be discouraged by that. Why? Because if it was totalizing, then you could be wrong. There's a dogmatic truth there, and the truth says it's this. And despite the fact that your research lends itself to a different interpretive model, if it doesn't conform, then you're wrong, and you failed. No, that's not qualitative methodologies, right? That's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is, what I'm doing here, is I'm letting you know that your interpretation is cool. Your participant's interpretation is cool. Don't stress. Take the time to recognize that you have the flexibility to offer a different account. And if it doesn't fit in the narrative, the historical narrative, the paradigm, then that's a good thing. Then that's a good thing. If it does, that's fine too, right? But you shouldn't just discard all of your effort, all of your work, all of the interpretations that you've, sort of the interpretive accounts that you've amassed in your data, because it didn't really turn out the way you initially thought, is no means for you to abandon your work, right? So that idea of determination, and I know you didn't think I was going to bring this back, but that idea of determination, all that I just said, if you felt anything in what I just said as a graduate student, if your spidey senses started tingling, that feeling as a consequence of what I said, you just felt the deconstructivist moment. You felt it in your body. And if I pull that off, then I'm really good. I don't know that I did. I'm not saying I'm that good. But if you felt, and you can only know what you felt, but if you felt it, if you felt, yeah, I'm going to do this. Yeah, he's talking to me. Yeah, I almost quit, but I'm not now. If you felt it, that moment, that sense in which I'm not going to allow this phenomena, this experience, these stressors prevent me from attaining what it is that I want, then you were in that deconstructivist moment, because otherwise your experience, your narrative was closed, right? I'm not going to pursue this and I'm going to move on, which, is fine. That is the case for some people. But in deconstructivism, we're not looking for loose ends being tied. We're looking at times for loose ends to remain loose. And I am in a position now where I have to get this work done. My interpretation doesn't conform, maybe, with others, and that's okay. And that's okay. Okay, so here's a key point. For the deconstructivist, epistemic claims refuse monotonicity, that is absolute truth function, either true or false. That's what monotonicity means. For the deconstructivist, epistemic claims about knowledge, they refuse sort of that formal binary truth, and obviously we see because of the refusal of binary opposition. Monotonicity presupposes a binary opposition. There's truth function to proposition X, it's either true or it's false. And a fixed truth functionality. Thus, there exists a deconstructivist logic that must be non-monotonic, that is fuzzy. It's gradations of truth. It's more or less true. It's more or less likely. We're not talking about absolute definitive truth as such, like the cat is on the mat. That wouldn't make a good sort of phenomenological, narrativized, that wouldn't make good qualitative research, because that's more journalism, right? It can make for great journalism. The fact that you found out some absolute truth, right? It was the case that this event occurred and this person perpetrated the event. That's great journalism, sort of objectively based. That's not good qualitative methodologies. Good qualitative methodology, in terms of your generalizability, at times you'll find that it's not so cut and dry, and there are gradations of truth. It's more or less likely. It's more or less true, right? For example, the idea of love. Great qualitative research. There is no absolute truth to love. You do love her if you do this, but if you do that, doing that demonstrates that you don't love her. No, that's not the case. No, I do love her. I've always loved her. However, I am the type of person that does this. But my having done this does not undermine my love for her. It might not be socially acceptable. It might not be morally or religiously acceptable. But that's somebody else's problem. It doesn't compromise love. Love isn't as absolute as that. Love is gray. I mean, anybody who's been in love knows this, right? Everybody has a recognition of who you are as a person, but some of who we are might undermine the happiness of other people. Me being who I am might not make you, particularly spouse, lover, partner, friend, whoever, happy, But am I going to compromise the authenticity of myself so that other people are happy? No. I'm sorry, but this is who I am. This is who I am. I still love you. I will always love you. But with respect to a recognition of me, there is a realization that you can't totalize love in, oh, well, you don't love her because you do X. Right? To do X means that you don't love. No, that's not what love is. I don't know anybody who understands love like nobody who's really lived life. Love is complicated, right? Love is a gradation. And one person might express love in that way, and another person might express love in that way, and they're both true. Both interpretations are true. So it's fuzzy. And I like fuzzy because it has a good colloquial sense. This means something different than logic, but I'm not going to get into that. So, wherein there are variable, flexible degrees of truth to the interpretive significance of the relationship between terms and their socio-cultural meaning. So I want to sort of draw this out so this makes sense, right? Because it's actually very, very important insight. It's probably the most important bit that I'm going to discuss with respect to deconstructivism. So the idea is this, right? We have a fact of the matter, and I should have put it in quotes in my notes, but right, we have a fact. And actually the fact really should be, spiral, right? So we have a fact of the matter. Right? We have a fact of the matter. And you recognize that this is a timeline, right? So obviously this is a state of being younger than this state, and this state in comparison to this state is a state of being older. I'm older here, I'm younger here, you get it, time. You can imagine that I look back when I was younger at the facts of the matter, and if I am having a conversation with a researcher, a good researcher recognizes, right, that good qualitative questions will ask the participant. So this is the researcher, and this is the participant. A good qualitative researcher will ask the participant, hey, think about the facts of the matter. How did you, or how would you perceive the facts at a state of being 25? How would you perceive exactly the same facts? Or how did you perceive exactly the same facts at 35? And then how did you perceive exactly the same facts at 45? You can imagine that the facts remain the same. The facts are the facts. But the ways in which your participant interprets the facts will likely change as he or she gets older. It doesn't have to be the case, but it will likely change. One and the same participant, same person, not a different person. One and the same researcher, not different researchers, same researcher. One and the same facts, not different facts, exactly the same facts. What we recognize, this is why the example of Watchmen is so good, because I mean it's so vulgar, the act, the attempted act, it's so viscerally bad. But the idea is, it's bad with respect to society. It's up to the individual to determine the level of morality, the goodness or badness of the act, right? So Spector looked at that act, and rather than interpreting that act and keeping a fixed interpretation of that act as forever being a bad act, forever being an instance where her physical weakness was proven to be ineffective in securing herself, she looked at that with the opportunity, probably, like, I'm going to take control over this situation, and I'm going to get some good out of this. And of course she has her daughter from it. And I mean, what better thing to have from a horrific experience than, a child that you love, a child that you care for, someone that can forever love you, that can forever transform she wasn't raped, but, the possibilities of what happened. Such that now, from that negative experience, I've reconstructed the event, such that Silk Spectre 2 is a demonstration, a proof that there's still good. I'm still in control, and look, this child is forever going to fuel me, everybody who has kids knows, right? Provided you're a good parent. There's a lot of bad friggin' parents out there. But provided you're a good parent, I mean, your kids are an infinite well of just motivation and determination. They're good vibes forever, right? So that the idea is, yeah, it was a horrific experience. It could have gone really bad, but look what I got. I got a mini me. I got a mini me from that, and this mini me loves me. This mini me fuels me, and I fuel him or her, right? And that's a good thing. So the idea is the deconstructivist approach recognizes that and this is proof. This is the genius of Derrida. And you got to shout out to Derrida. You know, shout out to the French in general. I gotta go to Paris and sip some of the Paris wine and Parisian wine and smell some of the Parisian air. I don't know what they got going on over there, but you know, the French existentialists just have an amazing way to see the world, right? This is clearly not an idealistic German way, the way that I was sort of raised and bred on. In the next 10 years of my life, I'm going to do a lot more personally with this school of thought, because I spent at least 10 years doing the German way. But I like the French way because it's not neat and tidy, right? It's not supposed to be sort of deductively sound and all n squared, right? No, leave it loose, leave it unraveled. Same event, same fact. It shows you that the fact is subject to the interpretational, right? The fact of the matter is subject to the interpretational fluidity, right? The facts themselves, you would think, well, no, that can't be the case, Jason, because the facts are fixed. Well, I mean, what do you mean by them being fixed? Are you saying that you can't transform? Of course you can transform the facts. A quick example, and I can't believe I'm incorporating it because this is partisan in a bit, but I got to show you a point. So, Fox News anchor, forget her name, says a rather contentious thing, arguably, right? She goes, Jesus is white, Santa Claus is white. Of course, I know it's big PR. Okay, everybody's talking about Fox News and this chick, whatever her name is. Jesus is white and Santa is white. And she said that as though that fact were fixed. Forgive me, people. I know that this is potentially contentious, and I am not trying to blaspheme people's religious beliefs. Right? That's not the point. This is not a critique of Jesus. This is not a critique of Santa. The fact of Jesus being quote-unquote white is itself, and I want to make sure that you understand this, but I have to make it a little uncomfortable so that you can see this. The fact of Jesus being white is a social construct. There's no body that we can exhume to look at. There's no DNA evidence to talk about sort of the ethnicity of Jesus Christ. So, with that, the actual color or the ethnicity or the race, quote unquote, of Jesus is socially constructed because, as we'll see in my race series when it comes up, race is a myth. Race is a myth, right? Race is a social construction. You ask any geneticist, you ask any chemist, you ask any biologist, race is a social construct. Social constructs are subject to perpetual change. Social constructs are subject to perpetual change, and thus, by evoking the facticity of Jesus' race, you undermine the fact because you expose it as being socially constructed. It could be changed just like that. 50 years, 100 years, just like that. It's that easy. It's that easy. It's that easy. Now, again, it's not to defame. This isn't talk about the religion. This isn't a reference. This is not an act of disrespect. I'm assuming that if you're watching this video, you're inclined enough to understand what I'm saying. Right? This is not to, belittle people's beliefs, but the idea is to claim that Jesus Christ is white and to recognize that race is a social construct and thus a myth, and thus, to take it further, linguistic community via Saussure can transform any social construct. Then you recognize that insofar as you evoke Jesus' race as being white, you immediately subjugate it to social construction. He could be Hispanic, he could be black. We can change anything about the race of Jesus, right? Because it's not about, it's not about his race. It's precisely the case that it's not about his race. But by evoking that, you expose some of the internal inconsistencies of it. So don't say like, oh, well, don't forget that despite the fact that whites are, going to, by 2030, probably be a minority group in the United States of America, and that minorities collectively might be the new majority, that, oh, we're just going to remind you that Jesus is still white, despite the fact that we're going to become the new minority, and oh yeah, Santa is white, because we can change that. We can change that relatively easy. I don't say that to be threatening, I don't say that to be disrespectful, I say that to show you the power of social construction, right? Revisiting the fact of race is socially fabricated, right? So to evoke that as though it were fixed is precisely to show that it's not fixed, because the thing that you're referring to isn't the gravitational constant. It's not sort of, it's not a truth of physics, it's a truth of social construction, and all socially constructed truths are open to this fluidity. So you destabilize the truth. You destabilize the fact by evoking it as though it were fixed, right? Super heady stuff, but you get the idea, right? This is an important bit. Okay, page 7. So Derrida's conceptualization of the snag as a reluctance of subjective meaning and subjectivity. Remember, I was talking about subjective interpretation at the beginning of the lecture series. And some water. A little parched here. But with respect to the snag, subjective interpretation, subjective meaning isn't, you can imagine that on my shirt there was a loose end hanging from my shirt. And the idea is I want to totalize my shirt so that my shirt is uniform, and I'm inclined to pull that string and pop it so that the surface is smooth and it's not like a frayed edge. I would cut it or what have you. And the idea is no, to leave it snagged, right? And we'll understand a little bit more how this works. So Derrida's conceptualization of the snag as a reluctance of subjective meaning and subjectivity to be defined can be operationalized within a qualitative methodology as a willingness to, quote-unquote, agree to disagree. Now, the term is aporia, and in the Platonic dialogue, Plato's dialogues are defined by this phenomena, aporia. And the idea is, it is a recognition that truth can't be attained. Socrates and the interlocutor, the perfect example is Euthyphro on the steps leading up to the apology, leading up to the prosecution of Socrates, right? So Socrates is going into the courthouse, he meets Euthyphro on the steps, they get into a debate, Euthyphro and Socrates, and they agree to disagree. Euthyphro committed an act that he thinks is pious, insofar as a serpent was killed. Socrates says, don't you see the contradiction in your beliefs? Socrates, I think, wins the argument. Euthyphro refuses to concede his position. They agree to disagree. That agreement to disagree is a preservation of that dis-ease. It's a preservation of that dis-ease. It's a refusal to have a totalizing account. Socrates isn't going to force his homogenized account on Euthyphro. Euthyphro is not going to force his homogenized account, totalizing account on Socrates. They're both going to argue that they're right, and there's going to be a sense of preserved tension there. It doesn't have to manifest in physical conflict. It usually, typically does manifest in physical conflict, depending, especially once you get to an international level. But the idea is there is a sense in which the preservation of this frayed edge, the preservation of that inability to consolidate everything into an agreement, the preservation of some incrementability, it reifies, I don't want to go too far into this, but it reifies identity. Right? It reifies identity, and I'll sort of stop there because it can get a little too complicated. So, and for those, it was a little bit advanced, but you guys recognize I'm coming to the tail end of this section, so it's going to be a little bit more jargon-filled. So the key point is a persistent awkwardness, a discomfort, a disagreement, a tension is not always a bad thing, right? There is a point at which, and this is true to form in terms of, I don't know if I want to say this publicly, but, so I'll sort of make it PC. It's a sign of power, not to abuse it, but it's a sign of power that, and I mean this, right? And to do this morally and justly, whatever that might mean, is important. But it's a recognition, like, you know, you don't necessarily have to like me, right? We don't necessarily have to be BFFs, but you do have to recognize and respect position in life. You do have to recognize and respect status, right? Because that status and that position is typically, barring cronyism and nepotism, it's a representation of work. It's a representation of ethic, a work ethic. It's a representation of accomplishment. And in that regard, you know, you might feel a little uncomfortable with how I do what I do. Not me specifically, I'm sort of playing a role here. You might feel a little uncomfortable with how I do what I do. And I don't have any malicious intent, and I'm not here to threaten. That's not my vibe. And you might disagree with how I approach it, and my style might not be something that you feel comfortable with. That's your problem, not mine. And it's okay that you find it discomforting. But that's also your problem and not mine. Because the idea is, I'm not the individual who ceaselessly, you can imagine like a people pleaser. And I am a people pleaser to an extent. And as I've gotten older, I've been less so. Right? I'm more when I was younger, this was a bit of a problem for me. But in my old age now, and I'm not old, I'm an old soul, but I'm not really that old. In academia, I'm a baby, right? In academia, I'm a newbie. In terms of what I've done, now I'm talking about me specifically, you know, my approach to education isn't like other people's approaches, and I don't disrespect how they teach their classes and how they have their lectures and the way in which they talk and such, and some people might be averse to my style. But the point of the matter is I'm not going to try and make you comfortable. I'm going to do me and hope that you appreciate my authenticity. If my authenticity offends, that's your problem, not mine. Because I know at the end of the day, my intent is just. I know that my ethic is sound. I know that my preparation is immaculate. And I don't have to be doing what I'm doing right now. So, if there's discomfort, I'm cool with that. People have to learn that, right? And you can imagine, with respect to qualitative methodologies, you have a participant. This would be a phenomenal qualitative research. You have a typology of people who seek to please others so much, and they lose themselves in the process, right? And there was a point in my life where I was headed down that path. Fortunately for philosophy saves me from the abysmal depths of that, because you destroy yourself. You give to everybody. Self-sacrifice, 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 self-sacrifice for everybody. And at the end of the day, you sit quietly in your room, in the recesses of your mind, and you don't have nothing left for yourself because you've given everything away. And sometimes you need to stop and say, no, I need to take time for me. I need to think about me. I need to preserve self. It's okay to indulge. It's okay for me to think about me and not worry about others. It's time for me. And, you know, most of the global tradition, East or West, which is a bizarre phenomenon in itself, especially given Western capitalism. There's an inherent contradiction in capitalism, but I'm not going to get into that now, is the preservation of this sort of perpetual self-sacrifice. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting. So what do? I transform my interpretation. Now I'm going to talk specifically for me because I think this will help you in assessing your own participants' narratives. This could be interpreted as wholly altruistic. Dr. Campbell's doing all of this because he's motivated just by everybody else and giving to everybody else and blah, 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 da, 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 da. There is truth to that. I do take great comfort in knowing that, 10, 15 years from now, people who have watched this video, and I can't wait for that day to occur, get a letter from a dean or a letter from a university professor, letter from an email from, a president of a university 15, 20 years from now, say, hey, Dr. Campbell, you'll never know me, but, I watched your videos when I was in undergrad or graduate school, and here I am now. I made it. I just want to give you, oh, man, it was perfect. That would be great, right? That would just be the greatest compliment ever. But the idea is, I take pride in looking back through my work. I take pride in seeing the amount of effort that I put up because it's undeniable. You can't say that I didn't do it because it's there to be seen. And it's not to prove a point to everybody else. It's a reminder to myself. Like, hey, Jason, look what you did. You did it. You didn't talk about doing it. You did it. You put up my last lecture series, and I'll stop at this point, but, my last lecture series, in 10 days, we put up 21 hours. That's a feat. That's an accomplishment, and it was good. And the notes were rich, and it's going to help people. So don't think that it's just sacrifice. You can imagine the personality type as a participant who might be jaded and might be disillusioned because there's nothing left to give. Right? They're exhausted, both physically and mentally, from any number of things. The category that comes into my mind, unfortunately, minority single women. Right? Black women, Hispanic women, black minority single women. You can imagine the level of exhaustion. They don't have a spouse. They don't have the economic support that would have been facilitated by a spouse or a significant other, a partner, what have you. They have the added economic burden of having to raise children and educate children. They have to work full-time. They have to take care of the kids full-time. And you can imagine that at the end of the day, this woman sits in the house without a spouse, with all the kids, put the kids to bed, and she might have 20 minutes to herself before she goes back into it each day. And the idea is to offer an account of that struggle, an account, a phenomenological experience, a phenomenological articulation of that struggle. And what you'll find is there are many, right? Maybe not a majority, maybe not a mass, but there are many women, minority women, who began, and also, Anglo women. I'm not to, disparage or exclude them. It's not my vibe, but there are many women who, quote unquote, pull themselves up, right? This is, the great American narrative, of course, and it's a bit of propaganda here. I recognize that, but there are many, many women who found themselves in that state and pulled themselves up. They got educations. They became, instructors. They went to education. They went into the business community, and their work ethic afforded them the one thing that they never had, which is a huge luxury. Money is a big luxury, but another huge luxury is time. They had the time to just be themselves. They had the time to step away from their social obligations, and it was a consequence of any number of factors, but one of it was sort of, commitment to self and education and work. I mean, that's a great narrative, right? It would be good to see how that's done. Why? Because so many women, so many single minority women who have children can't do that. They can't get to that point. So to find those women who did it and did it well and succeeded, and to find various ways in which they did it and generalize that finding to help those women who are currently in that situation is, think of it, that's one nudge forward. That's one incremental bit forward. And you better believe that the government's going to be interested in your research. Why? Because, that's going to decrease dependency, theoretically. It's going to incentivize upward mobility. There's nothing but good that would come from a research paradigm like that. So we need to be doing more of that, a lot more of that. We need to be doing a lot more of that type of research. So that's a good example, I think, right? So, G, an authentic deconstructive event remains beyond resolution, or totalized explanation, beyond fixed interpretation and meaning. And I've explained that almost ad nauseum now, so I think it's clear, so I don't want to go back over that point. And then lastly, H, qualitative applications. Students will feel that this approach to data interpretation feels vague. It feels meaningless, since meaning is never fixed. As a critique of deconstructivism, and I don't believe that we should attempt to fix the meaning of the facts. I don't believe that we should attempt to fix the meaning of the facts, because meaning is contingent on the interpretation, right? The interpretation is contingent on the meaning. The idea is, I have arrived at this interpretation. I've arrived at this ability to say, well, my interpretation of the event is that it was neither good nor bad. And someone says, oh, no, the meaning of the event is clearly it's bad. It means that it was bad, right? So let's go to the Silk Spectre example as a perfect example. Can you imagine how ridiculous, how ludicrous it would be for someone to tell Silk Spectre that she's getting it wrong? No, it was really a bad thing. And see, what you don't realize is, because of any number of factors, blah, 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 no, it means the experience that you had, it's really bad. How are you going to tell the participant about that? I mean, that makes no sense. This happens all the time. Any friendship, sort of general friendship story is always one friend telling another friend that their interpretation of the fact is ridiculous. Oh no, he said that, and that means he doesn't love you. And I've interpreted my relationship with him that no, he does love me. Girl, don't you see that he's playing you? He's this, he's that. You're going to tell someone about the meaning of their interpretation? No, that makes no sense. The individual is going to make the interpretation. The individual is going to derive that interpretation from the meaning of that event, the meaning of that relationship. And the idea is for us not to fix or impose a proper totalizing interpretation on events. And again, I just think I think it's very, very important. So focus on one. Participants should vocalize those external conditions that led to interpretational transformations, right? Tell me about the transformation. If we're going back to the example of single minority women and their attempt for upward mobilization within, American society as an example, good qualitative title, there's going to be an attempt to identify women who have, quote unquote, made it, who started from not having it, who met a certain set of criteria, were either married and then divorced or left and with children and full-time responsibilities and daycare and child rearing, no external help from the spouse, diverse group of women, diverse ways in which they quote unquote made it out. Recognize that your interpretation, your, as researcher now, account of their collective accounts is but one account of how it could be done. Generalize those findings. And what do you end up doing? You end up creating a condition in which women who find themselves currently in that situation can say, hey, I really like Mary's story. I can see myself doing that. I couldn't see myself doing, Stacy's story because that's not me, but I could find my way out doing this. Imagine if you would have just presented one story. So you only present Stacy's story, and you generalize just that one story. Well, you're immediately going to delimit the generalizability of your research because it's so narrow. Why not present an array, and I'm just using this example, but you can use anything. Why not present an array of opportunities, right? It's in, I won't talk about that, but it's in that state where individuals find themselves discomforted, as was said, that opportunity arises. It's in that state. And in that state, I transform myself. And we as researchers want to hear the narrative of how it was done. Tell me how you did it. I want to know how you did it. Why? Because the disclosure of that can help other people. And that's what we're in the business of doing. So, be they social, religious, academic, political, etc. Number two, participants should vocalize and should feel free and comfortable to vocalize those internal conditions that led to interpretational transformations, be they chronological distance from the event, enough time has passed that I can look back on the facts of the event and see them through new eyes, if you will. Their acceptance, refusal to accept the meaning of the event, this definitive meaning, and thus that definitive meaning is going to impose itself on my interpretation? No. It's how I interpret it. It's the meaning that I attribute to it. It's not going to, some external source is going to tell me that I should interpret the event in this way. No. Sort of relinquishing that. And I've done enough explanation on that. That has to be clear by this point. And it's an attempt to preserve the snag, the ambivalence, apathy toward both the event and its meaning. Apathy might be a bit harsh here, but I don't mean apathy in terms of an indifference to the event. Sort of a recognition that I am, well, I guess it is, in a sense, an apathetic view. I am neither interested nor disinterested in the event other than a recognition that I have the power. I mean, and this is the apex, right? And it's a perfect point to arrive at, right, at the end. I have the power to transform at any time relationship with my past. I have the power, and you should say this, like people should say this like daily. This should be like a mantra almost, right? I have the power at any time to transform my relationship with my past. I can be a victim of my past. I can be held in confinement by regret, by anger, by fear. Or I can look at the discomfort that I might experience daily. And we all experience this to some degree. And when it surfaces in traffic, when it surfaces, in the restaurant, when it surfaces in a conversation with someone, when it surfaces in the privacy of, wherever you are, recognize that I am in control of that. And use that discomforting, use that destabilization, emotional destabilization, right? You might cry, you might be angry, you might get anxious, you might become fearful, right? The past is encroaching itself back on you, and recognize that I'm still here, right? I'm still here, I'm still surviving, I'm still in a position where I can control that interpretation. And you do this for, a year or 2 years, and what you'll end up finding is you no longer have to do it, right? You get to a point, and I've been at this point for decades now, where, I recognize that these were instances of my past, and those instances of my specific personal past rise to the fore, but I'm no longer held captive to that. It's just a fact like any other fact, and I've long since moved on from that. And in looking back at those facts, I imbue meaning from those facts. I'm so much better now because I'm not that guy. Or I'm so much better now because I've used that experience to transform how I see the world. Or I'm so much better now because the existence of that fact in my past has freed me from, being the victim or being the victimizer or what have you. I've changed how I see things because of that fact, right? So there's tons of flexibility in this. There's no right or wrong way to go about doing it. I hope from this series and this section, because we're now concluding this section on deconstructivism, I hope from these first 3 or 4, I forget how many sections, I think it's first 3 or 4 sections from this deconstructivist approach, that you realize that the participant should be given the flexibility and the opportunity to deliberate in the act of informational exchange. Give the participant a moment. Make sure that you recognize that you don't have to necessarily be sort of obligated to getting every question answered, because then it becomes more robotic and less organic. Recognize that your participant's narrative don't need to end in a tidy sort of narrative where everything makes sense. That aporia could arise, and if it does arise where there hasn't been a resolution, and you still might have questions, and the participant might be in a position in his life or her life experience now where he can't conceptualize resolution, that it's okay. That it's not about always resolving some of the conflict, right? That's the biggest problem I have with conflict resolution, is the presumption that resolution has to be attained, that resolution is always the goal. Sometimes the attempt to force resolution only propagates further conflict. The idea is people will arrive at their own truth, and that their own truth is a preservation and a deferral of absolute truth, and that we should always defer that. It should be deferred. That we shouldn't try and impose meaning, that we shouldn't try and impose interpretation, a rightness or wrongness to meaning, a rightness or wrongness to interpretation, and allow for some of these conceptual edges to remain frayed. That is, allow for the participant not to understand, not to know, not to be able to resolve. And if that's the end, and that's how they feel, that it's okay to feel that way. That it's okay not to know. That it's okay not to have a resolution. And that's the deconstructivist approach. So, with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.